The funeral wasn't the end. The last handful of dirt struck my wife's coffin with a dull, hollow thud. That sound has stayed with me ever since. It wasn't just the end of Emily's funeral. It was the moment my entire life was divided into two chapters, before her and after her. The minister finished his prayer, people whispered their condolences, and one by one they drifted toward their cars. Their voices blurred together until they became meaningless background noise. I thanked them because that's what people expect a grieving husband to do. Inside, I felt completely empty. For 18 months, my life had revolved around hospital rooms, treatment schedules, and impossible hope. Emily fought harder than anyone I've ever known. Even on her worst days, she worried more about everyone else than herself. Now she was gone, and the silence she left behind was louder than anything I'd ever heard. I remained beside her grave long after most of the guests had left. My plan was simple. Go home. Pack away her clothes before I lost the courage. Find some way to survive the first night alone. That's when I noticed someone standing a short distance away. Meline, Emily's stepmother. She wasn't connected by blood, but blood had never defined family. She had raised Emily from the time she was 10 years old and loved her as fiercely as any mother ever could. She walked toward me without saying a word and gently took both of my hands. Her grip was steady, grounding. "Don't go back to that house tonight," she said quietly. I looked at her, confused. "You shouldn't be alone." "I'll manage," I answered automatically. I'd been saying those words for months. To doctors, to nurses, to relatives, to anyone who asked how I was holding up. Meline slowly shook her head. "No, Jackson. You've spent too long carrying everyone else. You don't have to carry this alone." Something inside me cracked. For the first time since Emily became sick, someone wasn't asking me to be strong. They were giving me permission to stop pretending. I lowered my head and nodded. Very few people knew what I did before hospitals became my second home. For nearly 15 years, I'd worked as a forensic auditor, uncovering financial fraud that most people never noticed. My career had been built on finding the one detail everyone else overlooked. But grief changes a person. For months, I hadn't cared about numbers, or evidence, or the truth hiding beneath paperwork. I only cared that my wife wasn't coming home. That evening, I followed Meline to her house instead of returning to mine. As we pulled into her driveway, I glanced toward the opposite side of the street. A black SUV was parked beneath a large oak tree. Inside sat a man watching the house. He wasn't crying. He wasn't paying his respects. The moment he realized I'd noticed him, he started the engine and drove away without a word. "Who was that?" I asked. Meline's expression changed for only a second. "Emily's uncle," she answered quietly. "Don't worry about him." But the uneasy look in her eyes told me she was worried enough for both of us. I didn't know it then. Less than 48 hours later, that same man would arrive carrying legal documents, claiming the house no longer belonged to Meline. He believed grief had made us weak. He had no idea he had just challenged the one skill I hadn't forgotten: finding the truth hidden inside a lie. The man at the door. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the dull sound of dirt striking Emily's coffin. By sunrise, I gave up trying to rest. Meline was already awake when I walked into the kitchen. A pot of coffee sat on the counter, untouched. She stood by the window, staring into the backyard as if she expected someone to appear. Neither of us spoke. Some mornings, grief says enough on its own. Then the doorbell rang. Once. A few seconds later, it rang again. Longer this time. Meline closed her eyes and let out a weary sigh. "What do you want, Richard?" she called before she even reached the door. She opened it halfway. Standing on the porch was the same man I'd seen sitting in the black SUV after the funeral. Emily's uncle. He wasn't carrying flowers. He wasn't there to offer condolences. Tucked beneath his arm was a thick leather folder. "Morning, Meline," Richard said, wearing the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "I think it's time we settled the issue of this house." "You couldn't wait a week after Emily's funeral?" "The law doesn't pause for emotions," he replied. "Neither do I." Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside. His eyes found me immediately. I didn't realize the son-in-law was still here. I'm staying for a while, I answered. Richard gave a short, dismissive laugh. That won't matter. He placed the folder on the dining table and casually rested one hand on it. I've handled estate disputes before. Grieving families rarely read the paperwork. They usually sign whatever they're told. Meline's expression hardened. We're not signing anything. We'll see. He opened the folder and slid several legal documents across the table. The property belongs to the Gardner Family Trust, he said confidently. With Emily gone, the trust reclaims the estate. You'll have 30 days to vacate. The room fell silent. Meline stared at the papers as though the words themselves had knocked the air from her lungs. This was my husband's home, she whispered. He made sure I'd always have it. Richard shrugged. Then he should have updated the records. For the first time since Emily died, something stirred inside me. Not hope. Not anger. Instinct. My attention shifted from Richard to the documents. Years ago, I could spot forged financial records with a single glance. Tiny inconsistencies had sent executives to prison and uncovered fraud worth millions. That part of my mind had been buried beneath months of grief. Now, it was waking up. I looked at Richard. May I see the documents? He smirked. You wouldn't understand half of what's in there. A faint smile crossed my face. For the last 15 years, I've worked as a forensic auditor. I don't just read documents. I prove when they're lying. For the first time since he'd arrived, Richard's confidence cracked. It lasted less than a second. But I saw it. He slowly pushed the folder across the table. I opened it, scanned the first page, and one date immediately caught my attention. I didn't say a word, because if I was right, Richard hadn't come to claim the house. He had just walked in carrying the first piece of evidence that could destroy his entire case. The date that didn't make sense. I didn't rush. The biggest mistakes investigators make happen when they think they've already found the answer. Richard stood across the room with his arms folded, wearing the relaxed smile of a man who believed the paperwork had already won the argument. Meline didn't say a word. She simply watched me, waiting. I opened the folder and began reading from the first page. Then I read it again. I ignored the bold legal language and focused on the details most people skipped. The filing date, the trust registration number, the notary seal, the property survey reference. Years ago, I'd learned that fraud rarely hides in the headline. It hides in the fine print. I pulled a legal pad toward me and wrote down 4 dates. One by one, I compared them against the documents. Something felt wrong. Not one mistake. Several. I opened my phone and searched the public business registry. Then the county property records. I compared the information to the papers lying on the table. A pattern slowly began to appear. Only then did I look up. Richard. He smiled. So you finally realized this is over. I calmly shook my head. No. I've realized someone expected us not to read past the first page. His smile faded slightly. What exactly is that supposed to mean? I slid the papers onto the table. This ownership notice claims the property became part of the trust 22 years ago. It did. Then explain this. I pointed to the trust registration number printed across every page. This registration wasn't issued until the trust was reorganized 3 years ago. Richard didn't even glance down. Updated paperwork. I nodded slowly. So I thought. I flipped to another page. Except this survey reference cites a filing office that didn't exist under this name until years later. Then another page. And this notary commission began 6 years after the signature date. The room became painfully quiet. 3 inconsistencies. Different pages. Different years. All pointing to the same conclusion. Richard crossed his arms tighter. You're twisting technicalities. No. I'm following a timeline. He stepped closer. None of that changes who owns this house. Maybe not. But it changes whether these documents can prove it. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. Only for a second. Then he recovered. You know what? My attorney can explain it to a judge. He gathered the papers without hurry, trying to recover the confidence he'd walked in with. This conversation changes nothing. He closed his briefcase. You'll still be out within the month. He walked toward the front door. Before leaving, he looked directly at Meline. You should think carefully before wasting money fighting something you can't win. The door slammed behind him. Silence settled over the house. Meline lowered herself into a chair, staring at the empty doorway. I thought I'd lost this home today. I looked around the room. Emily's childhood photographs still lined the shelves. Her graduation picture sat beside the fireplace. This wasn't just wood and brick. It was the last place that still carried pieces of her. Emily had trusted her family with her whole heart. I wasn't about to let someone rewrite her story. I opened my laptop and created a new folder. Gardner Estate Investigation. This isn't enough to win, I said. But it's enough to prove we're asking the right questions. Meline looked at me. So what happens now? I had barely opened my notebook when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the estate attorney. The moment I answered, I knew something had changed. Jackson, she said urgently. Richard just filed an emergency petition with the probate court. If the judge signs it tomorrow morning, he can freeze every estate account before we uncover the truth. The first counterattack. I lowered the phone slowly. Meline didn't need to ask. She read the answer on my face before I spoke. What happened? I closed my notebook. Richard just filed an emergency petition with the probate court. Her shoulders stiffened. What does that mean? It means he's trying to win before we have the chance to expose him. And if the judge approves it, the estate accounts are frozen. The property taxes go unpaid. The legal bills pile up. And sooner or later, I paused. He argues the house has become a financial burden that has to be sold. For a moment, Meline said nothing. Then she whispered, he planned this from the beginning. I nodded. He expected us to challenge the paperwork. This was always his second move. An hour later, we sat across from Claire Montgomery in her law office. Stacks of documents covered the conference table. Claire adjusted her glasses and slid Richard's filing toward us. I've gone through this twice, she said. Legally, it's well prepared. She tapped the pages with her pen. I don't like admitting it, but his attorney knows exactly what he's doing. Meline's face fell. So, we're losing? No, Claire answered carefully. I'm saying this won't be easy. I reached for the documents without speaking. Unlike Claire, I wasn't reading them as a lawyer. I was reading them as an investigator. I ignored the legal arguments and turned directly to the financial exhibits. Tax summaries, trust expenses, management invoices, bank references. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was paper turning. Claire leaned forward. I've checked those numbers already. They appear consistent. I'm sure they do, I replied without looking up. That's what worries me. She frowned. What do you mean? Real accounting is messy. Perfect accounting usually means someone cleaned it up. Claire folded her arms. I still don't see a problem. I picked up another invoice. Then another. I compared payment dates against trust reports. Everything matched. Until I reached the management fee schedule. I stopped. Read it again. Then opened the annual financial statements. The room faded into silence. There it is, I murmured. Claire looked at me. What? I slid both documents across the table. These reports claim the trust collected management fees on this property for 10 consecutive years. Yes. So where are they? She blinked. They're listed right there. No. They're claimed. Show me where the money entered the trust. Claire reached for the ledgers. Several long moments passed as she searched through the reports. Then her movements slowed. She checked another page. Then another. Finally, she looked up. She stopped speaking. There aren't any deposits. I nodded. Exactly. You can't collect money that never appears in your books. Claire leaned back in her chair, shaking her head. I reviewed these documents twice. And I never questioned the accounting. Because Richard wanted everyone focused on the law, I said. I'd rather follow the money. For the first time since we'd arrived. Claire smiled. I think I finally understand why people hire forensic auditors. Before anyone could say another word, my phone buzzed. An email from the county archives. The property records I'd requested were ready. I opened the attachment. It was an old invoice for a land survey completed 22 years earlier. The client wasn't Richard. It wasn't Meline. It was Emily's late father. My pulse quickened. If he had ordered a private survey before the trust was finalized, then there was a reason. I looked at Meline. Emily had spent her final months believing this house would always protect the people she loved. I wasn't about to let someone steal that promise. Before I could explain my theory, another message flashed across my screen. It was from an unknown number. There were only 6 words. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. The threat behind the message. The words on my phone refused to leave my mind. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. No name. No number. Just a blocked sender. Claire leaned across the conference table. What is it? Without saying a word, I handed her my phone. She read the message twice before looking up. I don't like this. Neither do I replied. Meline folded her arms tightly. You think Richard sent it? I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I don't know. But I do know one thing. People don't threaten you when they're winning. Claire closed the file in front of her. From this moment on, don't meet Richard alone. Save every message, every phone call, every letter. I intend to. The drive back to Meline's house felt longer than usual. Neither of us turned on the radio. Neither of us tried to fill the silence. We were both replaying the same question. What was Richard so desperate to hide? As we turned onto Meline Street, I instinctively checked the rear-view mirror. A black SUV sat parked across from the house. Its windows were too dark to see inside. The moment our car slowed, the SUV's engine started. Without signaling, it pulled away and disappeared around the corner. Meline noticed it too. Was that? I don't know, I answered. But that's the second time I've seen that vehicle. This wasn't coincidence anymore. Someone wanted us to know we were being watched. The front door was still locked. Nothing inside looked disturbed. Even so, something felt different. I walked toward the backyard. Halfway across the lawn, I stopped. Fresh muddy footprints crossed the grass. They led directly to the old garden shed. They weren't here yesterday, Meline whispered. I nodded. Someone had been on the property, and they hadn't bothered hiding it. I slowly opened the shed door. Garden tools still hung neatly on the wall. Shelves were packed with faded boxes, flower pots, and decades of forgotten paperwork. Nothing appeared stolen, which meant whoever came wasn't looking for valuables. They were looking for information. One cardboard box immediately caught my attention. Dust covered every box on the shelf, except one. Someone had lifted it recently. I carried it onto the workbench. Inside were gardening receipts, utility bills, handwritten notes, and old maintenance records. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Then I noticed several folders had been returned in the wrong order. A hurried search. Someone had gone through everything, but they hadn't found what they wanted. Meline stood beside me. What were they searching for? The same thing we're searching for. The truth. That night, our dining room became an investigation room once again. Tax records covered one end of the table. Property maps covered the other. Hour after hour, we compared dates, invoices, and handwritten notes. The deeper we dug, the clearer one fact became. Richard wasn't chasing the house. He was chasing one missing document. Around midnight, Meline rubbed her tired eyes. I don't know how you keep doing this. I looked down at the old property survey invoice we'd already found. Emily used to tell me her father never threw away an important document. Standing there, I prayed she had been right. I held up the invoice. If he paid for the survey. Where's the survey itself? The room fell silent. Then Meline suddenly froze. Her eyes widened. I remember something. She pointed toward a heavy iron lockbox resting beneath an old bookshelf. My husband kept documents in there. I haven't opened it since he passed away. I carried the lockbox onto the table. Years of dust coated its surface. The small brass key still hung from a faded string. I slid the key into the lock. It wouldn't turn. I tried again. Nothing. The rusted mechanism groaned but refused to move. For one terrible moment, I thought the key might snap. Then, with a sharp metallic click, the lock finally released. Meline held her breath. Slowly, I lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay stacks of faded gardening journals, old family photographs, and beneath them, a thick manila envelope sealed with yellowed tape. Across the front, written in neat black ink, were 4 words that made my pulse race. Property survey. Do not discard. The envelope Richard never wanted us to find. For several long seconds, neither of us moved. The old envelope rested inside the lockbox as though it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Across the front, written in faded black ink, were 4 simple words. Property survey. Do not discard. Meline covered her mouth with one trembling hand. I haven't seen that envelope since my husband was alive, she whispered. Carefully, I lifted it from the box. The paper had become brittle with age. One careless movement could destroy evidence that had survived more than 20 years. I slowly peeled away the yellowed tape. Inside were several neatly folded documents. The first was a certified property survey. I spread it across the dining table. Every boundary line, every official stamp, every signature appeared intact. Meline leaned closer. Is this enough? I don't know. Not yet. Experience had taught me one lesson. Hope wins nothing. Evidence does. I examined every detail. The surveyor's license. The county filing stamp. The recording dates. Everything matched the records we'd already uncovered. Then something slipped from between the folded pages. A handwritten letter. Meline gasped. I know that handwriting. It's my husband's. Before she unfolded it, I couldn't help remembering something Emily once told me. She used to laugh whenever her father labeled another box in the garage. Dad thinks paper lasts longer than memory, she'd always say with a smile. Standing there, I realized she'd been right. Some memories survive because someone cared enough to write them down. Meline carefully unfolded the letter. Her voice shook as she began reading. If you're reading this, then I'm no longer here to explain why I kept these papers hidden. She paused, wiping away a tear. Then continued. Richard never accepted my decision to remove this house from the Gardner family trust. He believed everything carrying the Gardner name would eventually belong to him. The room fell silent. That's why I hired a private surveyor and completed the transfer quietly with my attorney. If Richard ever claims ownership of this home, these documents will prove he is lying. The letter slipped gently onto the table. Neither of us spoke. Emily had always believed her father was simply organized. Now I understood the truth. He hadn't been organizing paperwork. He'd been protecting his family, even after he was gone. I searched the envelope once more. There was one final document, a cashier's check. The amount matched the survey invoice we'd already found. The payment, the survey, the letter. Separately, they raised questions. Together, they told one complete story. For the first time since Richard appeared at Meline's front door, we weren't defending ourselves anymore. We finally had proof. Meline looked at the letter resting on the table. Emily never knew he did all this. I carefully folded the pages. He wasn't trying to leave her an inheritance. He was trying to make sure she'd always have a home. Before I could return the documents to the envelope, my phone rang. It was Claire. I answered immediately. Jackson, she said without hesitation. Richard's attorney just canceled tomorrow's mediation. I frowned. Why? There was a long pause. When Claire spoke again, her voice was far more urgent. Because Richard knows his legal case is collapsing. If he can't win in court, he'll try to make the evidence irrelevant. What do you mean? I've confirmed he's arranged a private showing of the house tomorrow morning. My stomach tightened. If that sale closes before the court can intervene. She didn't let me finish. Proving fraud becomes far more complicated. And Richard knows it. I looked at the envelope lying on the table. After 22 years, we had finally uncovered the truth. Now we had less than 24 hours to stop Richard from making that truth disappear forever. Richard's last gamble. I barely slept that night. The envelope rested inside a fireproof document case on the dining room table. Every time I woke up, I found myself checking to make sure it was still there. 22 years. That's how long Emily's father had protected those papers. Now it was our turn. Just after 7 that morning, Claire arrived carrying a leather briefcase. She carefully spread the property survey, the cashier's check, and the handwritten letter across the table. I spent half the night verifying these, she said. The surveyor's license was valid. The county recording stamp is authentic. And the cashier's check cleared on the exact date listed. She looked directly at me. These documents will stand up in court. For the first time since Emily's funeral, Meline smiled. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was relief. A quiet belief that maybe her husband had protected his family after all. Claire checked her watch. The private showing starts at 11. If we're going to stop Richard, we have to do it before anyone signs a contract. We arrived at the house 15 minutes before the scheduled showing. A silver SUV was already parked in the driveway. Moments later, another vehicle pulled in behind it. A middle-aged couple stepped out, smiling politely as they admired the property. They had no idea they were about to become part of a family deception that had lasted more than 2 decades. Richard stood on the front porch dressed in a tailored charcoal suit. The confidence on his face vanished the moment he saw us. "I thought we'd settled this," he said. I calmly shook my head. "No. You hoped we'd give up." Claire stepped forward. "This property is the subject of an active ownership dispute." The couple immediately stopped walking. The husband exchanged a nervous glance with his wife before quietly taking her hand. Instinctively, they took a small step back toward their car. Richard forced an uneasy smile. "Please don't misunderstand. This is nothing more than a disagreement between relatives." I opened my briefcase. Slowly, I removed the aged manila envelope. Richard froze. His eyes locked onto it. Emily used to laugh and say her father trusted paperwork more than promises. Standing there with those documents in my hands, I finally understood why. Some promises fade with time. The truth, when it's preserved, doesn't. Richard stared at the envelope as though he'd seen a ghost. "You found it," he whispered before he could stop himself. The words hung in the air. He realized his mistake immediately. So did everyone else. "You've seen these documents before?" Claire asked quietly. Richard straightened his jacket, trying to recover. "I don't know what you're talking about." Without responding, I removed the certified survey. Then the cashier's check. Finally, Emily's father's handwritten letter. I placed each document carefully on the hood of my car. The morning breeze lifted the edges of the paper. I held them firmly in place. "This letter explains exactly why the house was removed from the trust," I said. Richard laughed, but the confidence behind it was gone. "A handwritten letter proves nothing. On its own. No. But together with certified surveys, verified payment records, and county filings, it tells the complete story." The prospective buyers looked at the documents. Then at Richard. The husband quietly guided his wife another step backward. Neither of them wanted to buy a house surrounded by legal uncertainty. For the first time since we'd met, Richard no longer looked like a confident man protecting his rights. He looked like someone watching 20 years of carefully constructed lies collapse in front of him. His breathing became uneven. His eyes never left the envelope. Then, without another word, he lunged toward the documents. "Richard, don't!" Meline shouted. Everything happened in a heartbeat. His hand reached across the hood of the car, only inches away from the survey. If he tore those papers apart, the evidence we'd spent days uncovering could be damaged before it ever reached a courtroom. And in that terrifying instant, The future of Emily's family rested on who reached the documents first. The truth wins. Richard, don't. Meline's voice echoed across the front yard. Richard ignored her. His hand shot across the hood of my car, reaching for the survey. But years of examining evidence had taught me one important habit. You never leave original documents unprotected. The moment I saw him move, I pulled the document case toward me. His fingertips brushed the edge of the envelope, but they never reached the papers inside. Richard stumbled a step forward before catching himself. For a long second, no one spoke. The silence was broken by Claire. "That's enough." Her voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone who had spent years inside courtrooms. She stepped between Richard and the documents. "Mr. Gardner, you've just attempted to interfere with evidence in the middle of an active ownership dispute." Richard tried to regain his composure. "I was simply retrieving family documents." Claire looked directly at him. "They're no longer just family documents. They're evidence." The prospective buyers had seen enough. The husband gently placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "I think we should leave." His wife nodded immediately. Without another word, they walked back to their SUV. Richard watched them drive away. His last chance to sell the house disappeared with them. For several seconds, he stood perfectly still. The confidence he'd carried since Emily's funeral was gone. In its place was something I'd never seen on his face before. Defeat. He looked at me. "You think you've won?" I shook my head. This was never about winning. It was about telling the truth. His eyes drifted toward the envelope one final time. Then, without another word, he turned and walked toward his car. He didn't slam the door. He didn't make another threat. He simply drove away. Some battles end with shouting. Others end with silence. 3 weeks later, the probate court was noticeably quieter than I'd expected. There were no dramatic speeches, no surprise witnesses, no emotional outbursts. Just documents, verified records, certified filings, and a timeline that couldn't be ignored. Claire carefully presented the survey, the cashier's check, and Emily's father's handwritten letter. Each document supported the next. Together, they told the same story. Richard's attorney tried to argue that the papers were misunderstood. But every time another verified record was introduced, that argument became weaker. Finally, the judge looked toward Richard. "Do you have any evidence that contradicts these authenticated documents?" Richard remained silent. His attorney quietly lowered his head. That silence answered the question better than words ever could. The court ruled that the property had been legally removed from the Gardner family trust more than 20 years earlier. Meline was confirmed as the rightful owner. Richard's claim was dismissed. As we stepped outside the courthouse, Meline stopped on the front steps. Tears filled her eyes. "My husband kept his promise." I smiled. "He did. And Emily never stopped believing he would." For a moment, neither of us spoke. I thought about something Emily used to tell me whenever life felt uncertain. The truth doesn't disappear. Sometimes it just waits for someone willing to find it. Standing there, I realized she had inherited that belief from her father. He trusted paperwork more than promises. She trusted people. Somehow, both of them had been right. A week later, I helped Meline place the old envelope back into the iron lockbox. This time, we added one more document. A certified copy of the court's final judgment. She smiled. "So no one has to fight this battle again." I closed the lid gently. "No, they won't." Before leaving, I walked through the house one last time. Emily's childhood photographs still lined the hallway. The afternoon sunlight poured through the living room windows exactly as it had the first day I'd visited years earlier. The house hadn't just been saved. The promise her father made to protect his family had finally been fulfilled. As I closed the front door behind me, I realized something. Grief had brought me back to this house. But the truth had helped me leave it. And for the first time since I buried my wife, I believed she would have been proud of the man who kept that promise.